Mornings in Groveville, Alabama, were wrapped in a heavy stillness that spoke of unchanging routines and invisible barriers. The town's red-bricked buildings, lined with white-painted trim, sat stoically along Main Street, as if watching the slow ebb and flow of time. Beneath the soft hum of passing cars and the occasional barking of a stray dog lay unspoken rules, their grip as firm as the sun-warmed pavement. For Mark Henderson, 17 and brimming with quiet determination, those rules were both a shackle and a challenge. Each day, Mark would set up his shoeshine stand just outside the grandiose Groveville National Bank, its marble columns gleaming in the sunlight. The bank stood as a symbol of power, clean, orderly, and forbidding. It was a place where men in tailored suits came to discuss numbers, land, and opportunities, their conversations heavy with confidence and exclusivity. To Mark, however, the bank represented more than just transactions. It was a window into a world he couldn't touch but desperately wanted to understand. He had polished the shoes of nearly every important man in Groveville. Men like Mr. Thompson, a portly businessman with a penchant for bragging about his investments, and Mr. Avery, a chauffeur with a sharp tongue and an even sharper eye. As Mark worked, his hands moving methodically over leather, his ears absorbed every detail, numbers, names, deals whispered with the assumption that he, a black boy with a cloth in his hand, couldn't possibly understand their significance. Mark did understand. He understood far more than he let on. Beneath his shoe-shine box, hidden from prying eyes, was a small leather notebook where he jotted down snippets of conversations. Interest rates, property values, mortgage terms, he captured it all. To anyone else, it might have seemed like idle curiosity. But to Mark, it was preparation. Each note he took felt like a tiny crack in the wall that separated him from the life he wanted. "Boy, you shine like you're thinking too hard," Mr. Thompson chuckled one morning, his voice thick with condescension. "Don't let those wheels turn too fast, or you'll wear yourself out." Mark smiled politely but didn't respond. He had learned long ago that silence was its own kind of armor. Words could be twisted, but silence was safe. "Yes sir," he murmured, buffing the man's shoe to a mirror shine. Inside, though, a fire burned. It was the same fire that kept him up at night, staring at the peeling ceiling of his bedroom and dreaming of a world far beyond Groveville's tight boundaries. That fire flickered dangerously one afternoon when Mr. Avery caught sight of Mark lingering a bit too long near the bank's entrance. The chauffeur's shadow fell over him like a thundercloud. "You listening to things that ain't your business, boy?" Avery's voice was low and sharp, laced with the authority that came from years of enforcing unwritten rules. Mark straightened his shoulders, clutching his shoe-shine box. "Just doin' my job, sir." "Your job," Avery sneered, stepping closer, "is to shine shoes and keep your head down. Don't go getting ideas. You're lucky to be out here at all." Mark felt his fists tighten around the handle of his box, but he forced himself to nod. "Yes, sir." As he walked away, Avery's words echoed in his mind, heavy with the weight of their intent. They were meant to remind him of his place, to tether him to the narrow life that Groveville deemed acceptable for someone like him. But instead of breaking him, they only deepened his resolve. That evening, Mark returned to the small two-room house he shared with his father, George Henderson. His father sat at the kitchen table, his work-worn hands wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee. George had spent the day cleaning floors at the courthouse, a job he did with quiet dignity despite the indignities it often brought. "You're late," George said without looking up. "Something happened?" Mark hesitated, then pulled out his notebook and placed it on the table. George stared at it for a long moment before picking it up. As he flipped through the pages, his brow furrowed. "What is this?" he asked, his voice heavy with both curiosity and concern. "Notes," Mark replied simply, "from the men at the bank. They talk like I'm not there, so I listen." George's face hardened. "You think you're gonna make something of yourself with this? You think they'll let you?" "I have to try," Mark said, his voice steady. "I can't just sit here and wait for things to change." George sighed, running a hand over his face. "Mark, you're smarter than me. But smart doesn't mean much when the rules are set against you." They'll tear you down before they let you stand. Mark looked down, his jaw clenched. Then I'll figure out how to break their rules. The room fell silent, the weight of unspoken fears hanging in the air. George shook his head and placed the notebook back on the table. Just be careful, son. Don't let that fire in you burn everything down. That night, as Mark lay on the thin mattress in his room, he stared at the ceiling and whispered to himself, I'll find a way. The fire inside him wasn't a blaze of recklessness but a steady, determined flame. He didn't just want to succeed, he wanted to rewrite the rules entirely. The road ahead would be long and fraught with obstacles. But Mark was ready. For the first time, he didn't feel trapped by the walls of Groveville. Instead, he saw them for what they were, barriers meant to be broken. The summer heat in Groveville pressed down on the town like an unrelenting weight. The dusty streets shimmered under the midday sun and the air carried a heaviness that wasn't just about the weather. It was the weight of a world where progress came slowly, if at all, especially for a young black man like Mark Henderson. Mark spent his mornings polishing shoes and his evenings studying the contents of his notebook. Every entry represented a piece of a larger puzzle he was determined to solve. Yet, no amount of preparation could shield him from the realities of a society that thrived on drawing lines. Lines he was now determined to cross. One afternoon, as Mark packed up his shoeshine kit, Mr. Avery's warning still echoed in his ears. The encounter had shaken him, but it had also solidified his resolve. If he wanted more, he'd have to risk more, even if it meant drawing attention from those who believed he didn't belong. As he walked home, his polished shoes scuffing against the cracked pavement, he knew it was time to act. At the kitchen table that evening, Mark broached the subject with his father. George Henderson, who rarely raised his voice, listened quietly as Mark spoke of his dreams. California, Mark said, his voice steady but his palms damp. That's where I need to go. I've been hearing about it, opportunities for folks like us. They say it's not as rigid as it is here. George leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. California, huh? And what makes you think it'll be any different there? Mark hesitated. Because it has to be. If I stay here, I'll be stuck shining shoes until I can't anymore. Out there, I can try. I can build something. George sighed, his gaze drifting to the window where the fading light of the evening cast long shadows across their small home. You're asking me to let you leave everything you know. Leave me. It's not about leaving, Pop, Mark said, leaning forward. It's about starting. For both of us. I can send it to you when I've made it. I can give you something better than this. George's eyes softened, but there was a weariness in them that years of hard labor had etched deep. You've got your mother's stubbornness. That's for sure. She was always talking about better days, even when they felt like they'd never come. He paused, his voice quieter now. If this is what you want, you'll need more than dreams. You'll need money. Mark nodded. He had saved what little he could. But it wasn't enough. The next morning, he took a risk that would change everything. The Groveville National Bank was as imposing as ever, its marble columns casting long shadows over the cobblestone steps. Mark didn't enter through the front doors, he knew better. Instead, he waited outside, watching as Mr. Thompson exited, his leather briefcase swinging in rhythm with his confident stride. Mr. Thompson, sir, Mark called out, stepping forward. Thompson stopped, his brow furrowing as he looked Mark over. Henderson, isn't it? The shoeshine boy. Yes, sir, Mark replied, keeping his tone respectful. I've been thinking about expanding my work. Maybe setting up something more permanent. I was wondering if you had any advice. Thompson chuckled, a sound that carried both amusement and condescension. Advice? You think you can just step into business? I've been listening, Mark said cautiously. I know the basics. I just need a little help to get started. Thompson stared at him for a long moment before shaking his head. You've got some nerve, I'll give you that. But business isn't for folks like you. It's risky, takes connections, and money. Mark felt his face flush but didn't falter. I'm not asking for much. Just a chance. Thompson snorted, pulling out a cigar and lighting it with deliberate slowness. You've got ambition, boy, that's clear, but ambition without backing is just hot air. He exhaled a plume of smoke and stepped closer. You want my advice? Know your place. Don't go reaching for things you can't hold. Mark clenched his fists behind his back, forcing himself to stay calm. Thank you, sir. I'll keep that in mind. As Thompson walked away, his laughter fading into the distance, Mark felt the familiar burn of frustration. But frustration had always been his fuel. He didn't need Thompson's approval. What he needed was a plan. The next week, Mark sold his shoeshine kit to a younger boy for a modest sum and pooled his savings. With just enough money for a train ticket and a little left over, he packed a small bag and prepared to leave Groveville behind. George stood on the platform with him, silent for a long time before finally speaking. Mark, you've got fire in you. That's good. But fire can burn you if you're not careful. He handed Mark a small envelope. This is all I can give you. Don't waste it. Mark took the envelope, feeling the weight of his father's trust. I won't. As the train pulled away, Mark watched his father fade into the distance. For the first time, the boundaries of Groveville didn't feel like walls, they felt like a starting line. The journey westward was long and unremarkable, save for the occasional curious glance from fellow passengers who seemed to wonder what a young black man was doing traveling alone. Mark kept to himself, his mind racing with plans and possibilities. When he finally arrived in Los Angeles, the city overwhelmed him with its sheer size and noise. The air buzzed with energy, and the streets teemed with people from all walks of life. It was nothing like Groveville. Here, the rules felt looser, though not absent. He made his way to a cramped boarding house run by Clara's Uncle Joe, a man whose skepticism was matched only by his practicality. You want to make it here, boy? Joe asked, leaning against the doorframe. Then you better learn fast. This city's got teeth, and it doesn't care who it bites. Mark nodded, his determination unwavering. I'm ready. Joe smirked, shaking his head. We'll see about that. As Mark settled into the tiny room that would become his home, he pulled out his notebook and opened it to a blank page. He wrote one word at the top in neat, deliberate letters. Begin. The road ahead was uncertain, and the weight of Groveville's lessons still hung heavy on his shoulders. But as he stared out at the city that stretched endlessly before him, Mark felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. The streets of Los Angeles pulsed with life, a sharp contrast to the quiet routines of Groveville. Here, the sidewalks seemed to stretch endlessly, lined with a kaleidoscope of businesses and people from every imaginable background. Yet, even in the heart of such diversity, the lines of division were unmistakable. Mark Henderson was quick to notice the unspoken rules of the city. Though not as overt as in the South, the barriers were there, just more carefully concealed. Certain neighborhoods, shops, and opportunities seemed to close their doors before he could even knock. The city's promise of freedom came with conditions, and Mark was already learning how to navigate them. The boarding house, cramped and noisy, became Mark's base of operations. Each morning, he left with a notebook tucked under his arm, his polished shoes striking the pavement with purpose. He walked through neighborhoods where buildings stood tall and proud, their facades hiding the struggles within. His sharp eyes took in the details others might overlook. A cracked window here. A "for sale" sign there. Every observation was a clue, a potential step forward. It wasn't long before he discovered a small apartment building on the edge of a predominantly white neighborhood. The structure, though modest, exuded potential. Its walls were solid, its foundation firm. To Mark, it represented a possibility, a foothold in a world that didn't expect him to enter. But as he stood outside the building, studying its features and imagining its possibilities, a shadow fell over him. A man in a crisp suit approached, his expression guarded. "Can I help you?" the man asked, his tone cool and clipped. Mark straightened, keeping his voice steady. "I'm interested in the property. Is it for sale?" The man's eyebrows lifted in surprise, his lips curling into a faint smirk. "For sale? You mean you're looking to rent?" "No," Mark replied firmly. "I mean to buy." The smirk deepened into something closer to disbelief. "You do realize this is a white neighborhood, don't you?" Mark met his gaze, unflinching. "I realize that money is green. I have a legitimate interest in this property, and I'd like to speak with the owner." The man chuckled, shaking his head. "Well, good luck. But don't get your hopes up. People around here aren't exactly eager to sell to. He trailed off, the implication hanging in the air like an unfinished sentence. Mark felt the familiar burn of frustration but kept his composure. Thank you for your time. As the man walked away, Mark's determination solidified. It wasn't just about buying a building anymore. It was about breaking a cycle. This wasn't a place where he was expected to succeed. And that was precisely why he had to try. That evening, Mark sat in the tiny kitchen of the boarding house. The din of conversations and clinking dishes muffled by the thin walls. Clara, his wife, joined him at the table, her presence steadying as always. She had joined him in Los Angeles after securing childcare for their son, Junior. The city overwhelmed her too. But she shared Mark's belief that it held the key to a better future. I found a building today, Mark said, his voice quiet but firm. It's not much, but it could be something. Clara studied him, her eyes reflecting both pride and caution. You know they won't make it easy for you. I know, Mark replied, leaning forward, but I've been listening, watching. The black neighborhoods are overcrowded. People want out. If I can get a foothold here, I can rent to them. Do it fairly. We'd be ahead of the game. Clara nodded slowly. We'll need help, though. Someone to open doors you can't. Mark hesitated before speaking the name that had been circling his thoughts all day. Joe Mitchell. Clara's eyebrows lifted. Joe was well known in the black community. Not just for his successful jazz club but for his reputation as a sharp businessman with connections that stretched beyond their circles. But Joe was also a man who rarely took risks without guarantees. Joe could help, Clara said carefully, but you know he's going to want proof, something solid. Mark's jaw tightened. Then that's what I'll give him. The next evening, Mark walked into the Plantation Jazz Club. A world away from the tense interactions he'd had that morning. The club was alive with the smooth sounds of a saxophone, the air thick with smoke and the scent of whiskey. Joe Mitchell sat at a corner table, his sharp suit and confident demeanor making him impossible to miss. Mark Henderson, Joe said as Mark approached, his grin wide but his eyes calculating. What brings you here? Mark took a seat, his posture straight. I have a proposition. Joe leaned back, his grin fading into a skeptical smirk. Let me guess. You want me to invest in one of your big ideas? It's not just an idea, Mark said, his voice calm but firm. It's a plan. The city's changing, Joe. White flight is happening faster than anyone expected. If we can buy properties in transitioning neighborhoods now, we can corner the market. Black professionals want better housing. And we can give it to them. Joe laughed, shaking his head. You've got guts. I'll give you that. But guts don't pay the bills. What makes you think you can pull this off? Because I've been studying this for years, Mark replied. I know the numbers, the trends. And I'm not asking for charity, I'm offering you a partnership. You bring your connections, I'll do the work, and we'll both see the profit. Joe studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he leaned forward. You bring me a deal that's undeniable. And we'll talk. Mark left the club that night with more questions than answers. But he wasn't deterred. Joe's challenge only strengthened his resolve. Over the next several weeks, he scoured the city for properties, poring over real estate listings and knocking on doors. His notebook grew thicker with calculations and observations, each page a step closer to his goal. But as he worked, the reality of the city's divisions became increasingly clear. Every interaction with landlords, realtors, and tenants carried an undercurrent of suspicion. He was often met with polite refusals or outright hostility, their words laced with assumptions about who he was and what he could afford. Still, Mark pressed on, his vision unshaken. He wasn't just fighting for a building. He was fighting for a place in a city that didn't want to give him one. For every door that closed, he found another to knock on. And for every setback, he found a new way forward. In the quiet of the boarding house late one night, Mark stared at his notebook, the numbers blurring before his eyes. Clara, seated across from him, reached for his hand. You're doing this for all of us, she said softly. Don't forget that. Mark nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. He wasn't just building a business, he was building a future. One step at a time. Los Angeles carried on its restless hum as Mark Henderson prepared for what he knew would be one of his most critical meetings yet. The days of quietly observing, listening, and scribbling notes in his leather-bound notebook had given him more than insights, they had given him a strategy. But strategy alone wasn't enough. He needed resources, allies, and someone willing to take a chance on him. That someone, he hoped, would be Joe Mitchell. The Plantation Jazz Club was as lively as ever. But Mark's focus wasn't on the smooth rhythm of the band or the hum of animated conversation. He had rehearsed his pitch countless times. Each word measured, each point calculated to appeal to Joe's sensibilities. Joe, ever the savvy businessman, didn't waste words or time on sentiment. He respected results and people who could deliver them. Joe leaned back in his chair, swirling a glass of whiskey. As Mark outlined his plan, Mark kept his voice steady, his tone deliberate. He spoke of shifting demographics, the growing demand for quality housing among Black professionals, and the opportunity to buy undervalued properties before the city's inevitable expansion pushed prices higher. "You've got a lot of ideas, Henderson," Joe said finally, his expression unreadable. "But ideas don't pay bills. Why should I risk my money on you?" Mark didn't flinch. "Because you're already doing it, Joe. You've built something here." He gestured to the bustling club around them. "Where people come together, where they feel they belong. I'm offering the same thing a chance to build, to create something that lasts. But this time, it's not about music, it's about homes, stability, and the future." Joe's gaze narrowed. "And you think you're the one to pull this off?" Mark nodded. "I've been watching this city, Joe. I know what's happening, and I'm ready to act. I'm not asking for a handout. I'm asking for a partnership." For a long moment, Joe said nothing. Then, with a faint smirk, he leaned forward. "Bring me a deal that makes sense, and we'll talk." The next few weeks tested Mark's resolve. Finding the right property was like piecing together a puzzle where the pieces didn't quite fit. He spent long hours walking the streets, speaking with landlords, and poring over property listings. Many doors slammed shut before he could finish explaining his interest. Others opened just wide enough to offer a polite but dismissive excuse. Then, on a late afternoon in a quiet neighborhood, Mark found it. A modest apartment building with a faded, "For sale" sign hanging crookedly in the window. The building wasn't much to look at: peeling paint, a sagging porch, and a few broken windows. But Mark saw what others might miss. Its foundation was solid, its location ideal for the Black professionals he hoped to attract. The current owner, Mr. Carter, was an older white man whose weary demeanor suggested he was ready to let go of the burden. But when Mark introduced himself and expressed interest in buying the property, Carter's guarded expression hardened. "You want to buy this place?" Carter asked, his tone laced with skepticism. "Yes," Mark replied evenly. "I believe it has potential." Carter's eyes narrowed. "And just what do you plan to do with it?" Mark didn't hesitate. "I'll renovate it, bring it up to standard, and rent it to professionals looking for quality housing." Carter leaned back, crossing his arms. "Professionals, huh? And what kind of professionals are we talking about?" Mark met his gaze. "Doctors, lawyers, teachers, people who are willing to pay for something better." Carter's lips thinned. "You mean colored folks?" Mark refused to look away. "Yes, people who've been overlooked by landlords and banks alike." Carter let out a dry laugh. "You've got guts. I'll give you that. But guts won't make my neighbors happy. You bring that crowd here, and they'll run me out of town." Mark remained calm. "With all due respect, Mr. Carter, this building isn't doing you any favors right now. I'm offering you a fair price, and I'll take the risk from here." Carter studied him for a long moment before finally sighing. "Fine, but don't come crying to me when this blows up in your face." That evening, Mark sat across from Joe Mitchell at the jazz club once more. Sliding the paperwork across the table, Joe picked up the documents, his eyes scanning the numbers and terms with the sharp precision of a man who had seen his fair share of deals. "This is the property?" Joe asked, raising an eyebrow. "It's not much to look at." "Not yet," Mark admitted, "but it's got potential. It's in a transitioning neighborhood. With the right renovations and management, we can turn it around." Joe leaned back, considering. And you're sure you can handle this? You know they're not going to make it easy for you. Mark nodded. I'm ready. Joe tapped the edge of the papers against the table, his expression thoughtful. Then he smirked. All right, Henderson, I'll back you. But if this goes south, don't say I didn't warn you. With Joe's support secured, Mark wasted no time. The building became a hub of activity, with workers repairing the roof, replacing windows, and repainting the walls. But as progress began, so did resistance. White neighbors who had barely noticed the dilapidated building before now seemed to take issue with its renovation. A man in a crisp shirt and tie stopped Mark outside the property one morning. His expression tight. You the one fixing this place up? The man asked. I am, Mark replied. The man's jaw tightened. Are you planning on renting to colored people? Mark kept his tone steady. I'm planning to rent to professionals who can afford it. The man scoffed. This neighborhood's not for them. You're going to ruin it for everyone. Mark didn't respond, watching as the man walked away, his shoulders stiff with indignation. The incident was one of many. Windows were smashed, tools stolen, and contractors harassed. But Mark refused to back down. Each setback only strengthened his resolve. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the city, Mark stood outside the building, watching the workers pack up for the day. Clara joined him, her hand slipping into his. It's coming together, she said, her voice filled with quiet pride. Mark nodded. It's a start. The journey was far from over, and Mark knew the challenges ahead would only grow more intense. But for now, the sight of fresh paint and steady progress was enough. One building, one step at a time, he was carving out a space in a city that had long tried to keep him out. The renovations were nearly complete. The old building, once tired and weathered, now stood with a quiet dignity. Fresh paint coated the walls. New windows gleamed in the sunlight, and the faint hum of possibility seemed to settle over the property. Yet for Mark Henderson, the challenges felt as unyielding as the bricks beneath his feet. The morning started like any other. Mark arrived early, clipboard in hand, inspecting the final touches as workers hauled tools and supplies back to their trucks. Clara had promised to join him later, bringing lunch and a fresh set of eyes to catch what he might have missed. It should have been a day of accomplishment. Instead, it quickly unraveled into something else. The first sign of trouble came from the whispers. At first, they were just rumors that drifted through the neighborhood, warnings from local residents about the changes happening at the apartment building. It wasn't long before those whispers became more direct. Notes, scrawled in thick, angry handwriting, were left on the doors. Keep your kind out. One read. Another was shorter but no less cutting. This is a white neighborhood. Mark found the notes before the workers could. He read each one carefully, his expression impassive, and folded them into his coat pocket. There was no point in showing them to anyone. Not Clara. Not Joe. Not even the police. He knew how these things played out. The authorities might shrug it off as harmless pranks, and Clara would only worry more. No, this was his burden to carry, as so many had been before. By mid-morning, Joe Mitchell arrived, dressed in a crisp suit that was slightly out of place amidst the dust and debris. He surveyed the scene with his usual air of skeptical authority. Looking good, Henderson, he said, nodding toward the polished facade. But you've got company. Mark followed Joe's gaze toward a small group of white men gathered across the street. They weren't trying to hide their presence, leaning against cars, arms crossed, their gazes fixed squarely on the building. Their expressions spoke louder than any words: disapproval, disdain, and perhaps something closer to fear. Joe's voice was low. They're not here for the scenery. Mark nodded. I know. Joe studied him for a moment. You think they're going to cause trouble? They already have, Mark replied, pulling one of the notes from his pocket and handing it to Joe. Joe read it, his jaw tightening. Damn cowards, he muttered, crumpling the paper in his fist. What do you want to do about it? Nothing, Mark said calmly. We keep working. We finished the job. Joe raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. He knew better than to question Mark's resolve. By the afternoon, Clara arrived, carrying a basket filled with sandwiches and lemonade. She kissed Mark on the cheek and handed him a plate. Her smile warmed despite the tension in the air. "You're making progress," she said, gesturing to the freshly painted doors and the neatly trimmed hedges. Mark smiled back, but the weight of the day lingered in his eyes. "It's getting there," he said. Then, after a pause, "We've had some visitors." Clara's expression darkened. "The neighbors?" "Some of them," Mark admitted. Clara set the basket down and placed a hand on his arm. "Mark, you don't have to do this alone." He shook his head. "I'm not alone. I've got you. I've got Joe. But this fight, it's mine to lead." Clara didn't argue. She knew better than anyone how deep his determination ran. That evening, as the workers packed up for the day, Mark stayed behind to lock up. The air was cool and still, the sun casting long shadows across the street. He was about to leave when he noticed movement near the building. 3 figures emerged from the shadows, young men. Their postures tense, their eyes darting nervously. "Can I help you?" Mark called out, his voice steady. The tallest of the 3 stepped forward, his hands stuffed into his pockets. "You the one fixing this place up?" he asked, his tone sharp. "I am," Mark replied. The young man scoffed. "You think you're gonna make it better? Bringing in all your people?" Mark didn't flinch. "I think I'm giving people a place to live. A place they can be proud of." The young man's eyes narrowed. "This ain't your neighborhood." Mark met his gaze, unblinking. "It's not yours either. It belongs to whoever's willing to take care of it." For a moment, the young man said nothing. Then, with a sharp laugh, he turned and walked away, his friends following close behind. Mark watched them go, his heart heavy but his resolve intact. Later that night, Mark sat at the small kitchen table in his home, the day's events replaying in his mind. Clara joined him, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. "They'll come around," she said softly. "People resist change, but they can't stop it." Mark sighed. "Maybe, but it's not just about this building, Clara. It's about everything it represents. A home, a chance, a piece of something they've been told they can't have." Clara reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "And that's why you'll win, Mark. Because you see what they can't. You see the bigger picture." The next morning, Mark arrived at the building to find a surprise waiting for him. A group of Black professionals, doctors, teachers, and small business owners, stood outside, their presence quiet but powerful. They had heard about the project, about Mark's determination, and had come to show their support. A young woman stepped forward, a clipboard in hand. "We wanted to see the building," she said, her smile warm. "We're looking for a place to call home." Mark felt a lump rise in his throat, but he managed a nod. "Welcome," he said, his voice steady. "Let me show you around." As he led the group through the building, pointing out the renovations and the plans for the future, Mark felt a renewed sense of purpose. The resistance, the notes, the states, they were all background noise. What mattered were the people standing before him, ready to build something better alongside him. For the first time in weeks, Mark allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The road ahead would be long, but he knew he wasn't walking it alone. The letters came in waves. Mark found them each morning, slipped under his office door or tucked into the mailbox at the building. Some were polite but curt, penned by anonymous tenants or nearby residents who wrote of concerns about the neighborhood. Others were sharp-edged, their words cutting into the page with an intensity meant to provoke. "We don't want your kind here." They were unsigned, of course. Fear and anger often hid behind anonymity. Mark read each one without reaction. He folded them neatly, placing them in a file he kept locked in his desk. Clara had asked why he didn't throw them away, and he had simply replied, "Evidence." She didn't ask again. The first real confrontation came on a Tuesday. Mark had been meeting with one of the tenants, Mrs. Davis, about a maintenance issue when a loud knock interrupted their conversation. Mark opened the door to find 2 uniformed police officers standing stiffly on the doorstep. "Mr. Henderson?" the taller of the 2 asked. His tone clipped. "That's right," Mark replied evenly. "How can I help you?" The officer shifted his weight. "We've had complaints about noise and disturbances coming from this property. Thought we'd come by and check it out." Mark raised an eyebrow. "Noise? During the day, with construction going on?" The officer didn't answer, his eyes narrowing slightly. We just need to take a look around. You don't mind, do you? Mark could feel Mrs. Davis's gaze on him from the corner of the room. He could feel the tension in the air, thick and palpable. He took a steadying breath. Of course not, Mark said, stepping aside. You're welcome to look. The officers walked through the building, their boots heavy against the polished floors. They asked no questions, found no disturbances, and left without so much as an apology. Mark stood in the doorway, watching them retreat to their patrol car. Their postures relaxed now, almost smug. Mrs. Davis approached him cautiously. You think they'll be back? Mark nodded. Probably. The incident with the police was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, the resistance became more visible. Protesters, small groups of 2 or 3, would gather across the street, holding signs that read, "Keep our neighborhood safe," or "No to outsiders." They didn't shout or chant, but their presence was loud enough. Joe Mitchell came by one afternoon to check on the progress of the renovations. He stood by Mark's side, watching the protesters from a distance. They're not gonna stop, Joe said quietly. No, Mark agreed, his voice steady. But neither are we. Joe chuckled dryly. That stubborn streak of yours might just get us both killed. Mark didn't respond. He didn't need to. One night, Clara stayed late at the building to help Mark organize tenant applications. They were seated in his office, surrounded by stacks of papers, when a loud crash shattered the quiet. Mark was on his feet in an instant, rushing to the front door. Outside, a large rock lay on the ground, surrounded by shards of broken glass. A crude message had been spray-painted on the wall. Go home. Clara appeared behind him, her face pale. Mark, I'll handle it, he said, his voice low. He called the police, though he didn't expect much. When they arrived, they took a report but made no effort to hide their indifference. One officer even shrugged as he examined the graffiti. Kids, probably, he said. Not much we can do. Mark thanked them and sent them on their way. He stayed up late that night, scrubbing the wall clean. Clara stayed with him, silently holding the flashlight. The next morning, Mark gathered his team, Clara, Joe, and Matt Dot for a meeting. He laid out the events of the past few weeks, the letters, the police visits, the protesters, the vandalism. His voice was calm, almost clinical, as he spoke. They're trying to push us out, he said. They want us to give up, to pack up and leave. But that's not happening. Joe leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. You know they're not going to fight fair, Mark. This is just the beginning. I know, Mark replied, but we're not fighting fair either. We're fighting smart. Matt, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, spoke up. What's the plan, then? Mark outlined it. Tighter security measures, outreach to the new tenants, and a renewed effort to build trust within the community. He emphasized the importance of visibility, of showing strength in the face of resistance. We're not just fixing up a building, he said. We're building a foundation. For ourselves, for the people moving in, for anyone who's ever been told they don't belong. That weekend, Mark hosted a community event at the building. He invited the new tenants and local families, offering food, music, and a chance to connect. The turnout was modest but meaningful. Children played in the courtyard, their laughter cutting through the tension that had hung over the property for weeks. Adults mingled, sharing stories and tentative smiles. Mark watched from the sidelines, his arms crossed. For a moment, he allowed himself to feel a flicker of hope. This was why he was doing it. Why he endured the stares, the threats, the silent battles. It was for moments like these, when possibility felt tangible. Joe sidled up beside him, holding a paper plate piled high with food. Not bad, Henderson, he said, nodding toward the crowd. Not bad at all. Mark smiled faintly. It's a start. But the resistance didn't disappear. It never would. Mark knew. Change was slow, and fear of the unknown was deeply ingrained. Still, he pressed on, steady and unwavering, like the foundation of the building he had worked so hard to restore. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, cracks began to form in the wall of resistance. A neighbor who had once glared at Mark from her porch stopped by the building one afternoon to ask about the renovations. A local shopkeeper who had ignored him for weeks offered a tentative wave as he walked by. They were small gestures, but they were enough. Mark didn't expect miracles. He didn't expect to change the world overnight. But as he stood on the steps of the building, watching the sun set over the neighborhood, he allowed himself to believe in the possibility of progress. Even in the face of resistance, progress had a way of pushing through, quiet, persistent, and undeniable. The summer heat lingered long into the evenings, pressing down on the city like an unwelcome weight. Mark Henderson sat in his office, a single fan oscillating in the corner, barely cutting through the oppressive warmth. The building repairs were nearly complete, and the new tenants had begun to settle in. But the challenges were far from over. Resistance, though quieter now, still simmered just beneath the surface. The letters hadn't stopped, though they came less frequently. The protesters had grown smaller in number but still gathered from time to time. Their signs a faint echo of the uproar that had first greeted Mark and his team. But what concerned Mark most wasn't the overt resistance. It was the silence. The waiting. One afternoon, as Mark walked the property, he noticed Mrs. Davis standing in the hallway, her arms crossed. She was watching a group of children play tag in the courtyard, their laughter bouncing off the walls. "They're settling in," Mark said, stopping beside her. Mrs. Davis nodded, her lips curving into a faint smile. "It's good to see," she said, "but it's not easy, is it? Building something that lasts." Mark glanced at her, sensing the weight behind her words. "Nothing worth building ever is." She turned to face him fully, her expression serious now. "You've done a lot, Mr. Henderson, more than most would dare. But you know they're not done with you. They're just waiting for their moment." Mark nodded slowly. "I know." That moment came just days later. It started with an inspection notice, delivered early in the morning by a city official. Mark skimmed the letter, his jaw tightening as he read the list of alleged code violations. It was clear this wasn't routine. The complaints were minor: insufficient ventilation in a storage area, uneven flooring in the basement. But they were enough to warrant penalties, fines, and delays. Joe Mitchell was the first to hear the news. He showed up at the building later that day, his expression dark. "They're trying to bleed us dry, Mark. Hit us where it hurts." Mark set the letter down on his desk. "It's a distraction," he said. "They want us to lose focus, waste time and money." "Well, it's working," Joe snapped. "You can't fix a damn thing if you're busy chasing permits and paying off fines." Mark leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "Then we won't let it work. We'll fix what needs fixing. And we'll move on." Joe shook his head, muttering something under his breath. But he didn't argue further. He knew Mark was right. The repairs were handled swiftly. But the inspection was only the beginning. A week later, Mark received a summons to appear in court. A group of nearby property owners had filed a lawsuit, claiming the renovations to the building were devaluing their properties. The case was flimsy, built on speculation and prejudice. But it was enough to drag Mark into another fight. Matt Sullivan, who had been quiet lately, stepped up during this time. He had a knack for navigating legal jargon and spent long nights poring over documents, preparing for their defense. "They're grasping at straws," Matt said one evening, his voice tinged with frustration. "But they've got the money to keep this going as long as they want." Mark didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stared out the window at the city lights. Finally, he said, "Let them. We've got something they don't: patience." The courtroom was small, its air thick with the tension of whispered conversations and sideways glances. Mark sat at the defense table, flanked by Matt and their lawyer. Across the aisle, the plaintiffs, a group of middle-aged white men in tailored suits, sat with their legal team, their confidence palpable. The proceedings dragged on for weeks. The plaintiffs argued that Mark's building was attracting the wrong kind of tenants. Though they never said the words outright, their language was coded, veiled, but everyone in the room understood what they meant. Mark's lawyer was sharp, methodically dismantling their arguments piece by piece. He called on tenants like Mrs. Davis to testify, showcasing the positive changes the building had brought to the community. But the most compelling moment came when Mark himself took the stand. The courtroom fell silent as Mark adjusted the microphone in front of him. He sat tall, his hands folded neatly on the table. The plaintiff's lawyer wasted no time launching into his questions. His tone sharp. "Mr. Henderson," the lawyer began, "would you say that your building caters exclusively to black tenants?" Mark's expression didn't waver. "No," he replied. "We cater to anyone seeking quality housing." "But isn't it true," the lawyer pressed, "that the majority of your tenants are black?" Mark nodded. "That's true, but that's not because of any policy or preference. It's because, for far too long, quality housing has been denied to people who look like me. I'm simply providing an opportunity where others have refused." The lawyer's lips thinned. "And you don't think this has caused tension in the neighborhood?" "There's always tension when things change," Mark said evenly, "but tension isn't an excuse to deny people their rights." When the trial concluded, the judge ruled in Mark's favor. The lawsuit was dismissed, and the plaintiffs left the courtroom visibly frustrated. Mark, however, felt no sense of triumph. The victory was necessary, but it was hollow, a reminder of the constant battles he would face. Joe met him outside the courthouse, a cigarette dangling from his lips. "Well, you did it," he said, "but you know they'll be back." Mark nodded, his gaze steady. "Let them come." That evening, Mark returned to the building, exhausted but resolute. As he walked through the courtyard, he noticed the children playing tag again, their laughter cutting through the quiet. He stopped to watch them, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Mrs. Davis appeared beside him, as if summoned by some unspoken understanding. "You won," she said simply. "For now," Mark replied. She tilted her head, studying him. "And when the next fight comes?" Mark turned to her, his expression calm but firm. "We'll win that one, too." The battles were far from over. But Mark knew he was ready. This wasn't just about a building or a neighborhood. It was about the slow, steady work of change. And no matter how long it took, he was prepared to see it through. The early morning sun cast a golden hue over the neighborhood, the light creeping through the narrow streets and over the building Mark Henderson had poured so much of himself into. The renovations were complete, the units filled with tenants who had found not just a place to live, but a sense of belonging. Yet, the quiet of this morning wasn't one of ease. It was the calm before yet another storm. Mark stood in the courtyard, watching as a group of children chalked a colorful mosaic onto the concrete. Their laughter and play were a reminder of why he had fought so hard. Though the fight itself had taken its toll, the courtroom victory had quieted some critics. But others remained relentless, their opposition as steadfast as the barriers Mark sought to dismantle. Later that day, Mark sat in his modest office, reviewing a stack of financial reports. Across from him sat Clara, her calm presence as much a balm to his wearied spirit as her sharp mind was an asset to their business. "We're holding steady," Clara said, breaking the silence. "The repairs and legal fees have stretched us thin. But we've weathered worse." Mark nodded. "We have," he said, "but we're not just fighting for survival anymore. It's time we start thinking about what comes next." Clara raised an eyebrow. "You're not planning on taking it slow, are you?" Mark smiled faintly. "I don't think slow is in my nature." The next step wasn't about another building or another neighborhood. It was about building something bigger. Mark wanted to create opportunities beyond housing, to foster wealth and independence for the Black community. He and Clara discussed the idea of starting a small loan program for tenants who aspired to start businesses or purchase homes of their own. Joe Mitchell, ever the pragmatist, approached the idea with skepticism when Mark proposed it at their next meeting. "You're talking about putting money into people's hands," Joe said, leaning back in his chair. "People who might not pay it back." Mark remained calm. "I'm talking about giving people a chance. The same chance we were fighting for." Joe sighed, rubbing his temple. "It's a risk, Mark. A big one. So is everything we've done so far." Mark replied evenly. "But look where it's gotten us." Matt Sullivan, sitting quietly until now, chimed in. "He's right, Joe. If we're in this to build more than just buildings, we have to start somewhere." Joe shook his head but didn't argue further. He had learned long ago that Mark's determination was a force of its own. The first loans were modest, given to tenants who had demonstrated a commitment to the community. Mrs. Davis, the nurse who had been among the first to move in, used her loan to open a small clinic in the neighborhood. Another tenant, a teacher, purchased books and supplies for a tutoring program for the children in the building. The programs weren't without their challenges. Some questioned the sustainability of the loans, while others doubted the intentions behind them. Mark, however, remained steadfast, his quiet confidence slowly winning over skeptics. One afternoon, as Mark walked through the building, he was approached by Mr. Riley, the former owner of his first property. The older man had remained a peripheral figure in Mark's life, but his respect for what Mark had achieved had grown over time. "You've built something here," Riley said, his voice gruff but sincere. "We have," Mark replied, "but it's only the beginning." Riley nodded, a rare smile tugging at his lips. "You're a stubborn one, Henderson, I'll give you that. If you ever need a partner for whatever comes next, you know where to find me." As the months passed, the building became more than a home. It became a hub of activity and progress. The courtyard, once a place of tension, now bustled with neighbors working together, children playing, and community meetings held under the shade of a large oak tree. One evening, Mark stood on the rooftop of the building, gazing out at the city. The skyline was dotted with lights, each one a reminder of the work that remained. Clara joined him, her hand slipping into his as they stood in silence for a moment. "You've done something remarkable," she said softly. "We've done it," Mark corrected, his voice calm but resolute. "And we're not done yet." Clara smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "No, we're not." The challenges never fully went away. There were still threats, still setbacks, and still moments of doubt. But Mark had come to understand that progress was never linear. It was a series of steps forward and back, of victories and defeats, all building towards something greater. The legacy he was building wasn't just about buildings or loans. It was about the people who now had a chance to thrive, to dream, to fight for their own futures. And though the road ahead was long, Mark knew that every step, no matter how small, mattered. As the night settled over the city, Mark turned away from the skyline, ready to face whatever came next. For him, the work was never finished. But that was exactly how he wanted it.